What if God hates religion? What a daring and great title. The late author and columnist Christopher Hitchens, in his very famous book, God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, once said, religion ends, philosophy begins, alchemy ends, chemistry begins, astrology ends, astronomy begins. The idea he's making, the case he's making is that just as the ancient practice of alchemy has been surpassed and updated by chemistry, making the ancient practice obsolete, so the ancient theories of astrology and the meaning of the stars has been surpassed and updated by astronomy. No one takes ancient astrology seriously anymore. So the ancient idea of religion has been surpassed and updated by philosophy, meaning we no longer need to believe what our silly ancestors used to believe about life. It's a #1 best-selling book, and Hitchens makes his case that religion needs to be abolished because of all the atrocities in the world. And he gives personal accounts of religious-fueled violence in places around our world, including Belfast. His argument is that religion makes us into racists. So Christians, for example, I'm a Christian, are judgmental and hypocritical, those kind of arguments. And his point is fair to some extent when he makes it, though it falls foul to its own logic. Because at the end of the 20th century, the communist regimes of Russia, China and Cambodia all rejected organized religion and belief in God and ended up killing millions too. So whilst his point is well taken, and we need to listen to it, and there's no excuse for violence in the name of religion or Christianity, his argument is actually historically naive. Why do I mention this? Well, in an ironic way, Hitchens himself would never have seen it himself. Jesus agrees with him. He has a similar view on religion. But instead of saying religion ends, philosophy begins, Jesus is going to say religion ends because I begin. Today we're going to learn that Jesus is the great disruptor of religion. He hasn't come to reform religion, he's come to end religion and replace it with himself. He's going to have a much more penetrating and nuanced answer to the problem of religion than Hitchens does. And in doing so, he's going to condemn the kind of religious activities that all of us want to condemn. We're going to see Jesus gets angry with those. And I'm going to look at a section from Mark's Gospel, which is one of the biographical accounts of Jesus' life, written by Mark, where he engages with some religious leaders and disrupts their view of the world, particularly their view of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was an Old Testament principle from the Jewish religion, and they got in a muddle over it, and Jesus confronts them. And in a sense says, I hate the way you're doing Sabbath. Let me show you how to really do it when you know me. So we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the problem of religion. In the end, Sabbath ends up as slavery or any religious practice. The power of the gospel, that Sabbath can become freedom, or religious practices can become freedom. And the divided response over the Lord of the Sabbath. So let me read the passage. It goes like this. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along, and they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David," that's King David, "did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So his disciples are picking grain in the fields on a Sabbath day. Now, if you read the Old Testament Sabbath laws, it very clearly says don't work on the Sabbath, don't harvest the fields on the Sabbath. It says nothing about picking grain on the Sabbath as you walk through fields. But over the years, the Pharisees have tried to follow the Sabbath laws, and they'd actually invented 39 extra laws that are not in the law of Moses, were in the Talmud, the Jewish traditions, man-made rules about the Sabbath. So whilst the law God gave Moses never said you can't eat grain on the Sabbath, it said don't harvest, in their rule book, in their religion, you couldn't. And so Jesus pushes back and says, do you remember David, your king, the Jewish King David and his companions? They were hungry once and they were out and about and they had no bread, and so they went to the high priest, but no one was supposed to eat the bread in the temple, just the priests. But David and his companions ate it. And David knew, and the high priest Abiathar knew, and here Jesus affirms that though technically they had broken the law of God, they were not condemned for it because human need is a higher law than religious ritualism. And more to the point of the Sabbath was to bring refreshment and healing and wholeness to mankind, take a day of rest. So Jesus says, look, this whole point of the Sabbath is it's made for man. It's a day of celebration, of feasting, of worship and community. So the Sabbath is for our good, for our restoration, for our rest. We're not to get in a straitjacket with all these religious rules about it. To get your knickers in a twist about a few grains of corn is dramatically to miss the wood from the trees, so much so that you go against the very life-giving law of the Sabbath. So Jesus is starting to show, I hate your way of doing religion, to these Pharisees, these religious leaders in ancient Israel, by quoting their scriptures, the Old Testament, back to them. And then he goes on, he has another clash with them. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue. He's on their territory. And a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he'd heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. And then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. On this occasion, the religious leaders are trying to trap Jesus. And watching him closely in the synagogue, will he heal a man's hand on a Sabbath day? Jesus knows what's going on. So he chooses to fully expose their motives and says, stand up to the man. Jesus is going to say, I am the great disruptor to man-made religion. And I'm going to disrupt it right now on your territory in front of you all. And he says to them, he asks them this brilliant question which gets to the heart of the Sabbath. Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? They had tried to trap him, he traps them. Whichever way they answer, they are doomed. If we say to do evil, we can't say that. If we say to do good, well, then we have to condone healing on the Sabbath, but our rule book says you can't do that. And notice how Mark says in verse 5 on the screen, he looked at them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. The talk is, does God hate religion? Often, yes. Man-made religion, where you're not allowed to heal people, he absolutely hates. You see, the problem with man-made religion is you end up with a stubborn heart. So when the Son of God walks into your presence, wanting to perform a beautiful act of healing, you reject him. That's what man-made religion does. Moments before, Jesus had said this in Mark's Gospel, it is not the healthy that need the doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. In other words, Jesus is saying, if you think you're sorted, if you think you don't need forgiveness, if you think you're healthy and well, you won't need me. I'm a doctor. I've come for those that know they are ill and in need. And unless you know you need forgiveness, I cannot be your great physician and heal you. Tax collectors, sinners, all those that are messed up, they keep coming to me and admitting they're messed up, admitting they need forgiveness. And I embrace them and love them. I'm a doctor for those people. But for the self-righteous who are too proud to admit they're ill, like you religious leaders, I can't help you. You're so self-righteous, you won't accept me, the doctor. You're so proud, you won't allow my healing into my life or this man's life. And so Jesus is getting angry at their stubborn hearts because the Sabbath, the law in the Old Testament, was about restoring the diminished, replenishing the drained, repairing the broken. Healing the man's hand is exactly what the Sabbath was about. But these religious leaders are so concerned with their petty rule book, they don't want Jesus and they don't want this man to be healed. As a guy called Tim Keller says, their hearts are as shriveled as the man's hand. They're insecure and anxious about their regulations. They're tribal, judgmental, and self-obsessed instead of caring about the man. Why? Religion. So do you see the problem of religion? Something that should bring life ends up bringing death. Something that should bring freedom ends up bringing slavery. Man-made religion. So let's move on to my second point, the power of the gospel. What I'm about to tell you, I think, is the most fundamental truth to understanding the difference between what I'm going to call in this talk religion and the gospel, or religion and the heart of the Christian faith. It goes like this. Religion says this: I obey, therefore I'm accepted. I have to come up with all my rules of what I must do to make sure God accepts me, I accept myself, society accepts me. I just need to be good in some way, whatever your rule book is, so that I'm accepted. Christianity, or the gospel, says I'm accepted by a doctor who says I'm a mess, but he's come to heal me, and he accepts me as I am, and as a response, I obey. So two people could be trying to observe the Sabbath, obeying, for radically different reasons. One ends up being loving and kind, Jesus. One ends up being hard-hearted and stubborn, the Pharisees. Why? Which paradigm are you operating out of? And by the way, myself included, I think we all tend to this one, even if you don't call yourself religious. We think we have to be good to be accepted. Even to accept ourselves, to look ourselves in the mirror, we have to have a certain level of moral criteria to be accepted by society, and if you believe in a God, to be accepted by that God. So we come up with a list of things in order to do to be a good Christian or a good moral person. You know, I don't do this, I do this, I do that, I'm not like those people, those kind of things. But if you're doing those things to gain acceptance from God or whatever else, you're in the religion paradigm. You're trying to ensure that you're a good person. And we end up no better than these religious leaders, these Pharisees in the story who are judgmental and hypocritical. Why do we do it? Why do we all think, no, but I have to do something to be accepted? The Bible says we all have inbuilt in us now, because of the fall, a sense of guilt and shame that we're trying to deal with, and an insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied in this world. So we're doing these things to ensure we're acceptable. We're doing these things to try and justify ourselves and cover up, and we feel radically insecure and vulnerable. We're trying to cover up our mediocrity. Okay, I don't want to be mediocre. I want to be respectable. And one of the things we do to cover up is we become religious. I'm good and moral. I'm going to put God in my debt. He now owes me. I've been good, God, now you bless me. Like Father Christmas. You know, have you been good this year? Is Santa going to come? That's how we think about God. But Jesus says, no. You're sick. You're all sick. Every single one of you is sick. You need a doctor. I'm the doctor. But you don't go to the doctor pretending you're okay. Hey, doc, I've come to see you because I'm fine. You go, hey, doc, I've come to see you because I've got a problem. And Jesus says, when you realize you've got a problem with guilt and shame and a dissatisfied heart, you'll come to me and I'll bring you healing. So the gospel is I'm accepted in all my mess, in all my insecurity, in all my vulnerability, in all my shame, in all my guilt, in all my failure, when I couldn't obey. And God loves me as I am. And in response to that, I think about what does it mean to respond to a God who's loved me unconditionally when I was a mess. I don't put God in my debt. How could I put God in my debt? I don't need to put God in my debt. Because I'm accepted by the great physician, Jesus. Therefore I obey. Which paradigm are you living in? I don't care if you think you're religious here today or not. Are you thinking, I must be this kind of a person, your rule list, to be accepted? Or do you think, no, I'm accepted by something outside of myself, and all my obedience is in response? Let me push you a bit further. In the Old Testament, Sabbath ultimately was about identity and trust. The Jewish people, in contrast to when they were slaves in Exodus, were said, one day a week you do not work. One day a week, your identity, your security, your value, you're going to say, is not in my work. I don't gain my value, my security through my work, through my making money, through harvesting, through providing for myself. I trust that God is going to give me my value, my security. He's going to provide for me. So unlike all the other nations, particularly when they were slaves in Egypt, they worked every day. We don't work one day. And it was about our identity, and our trust is in the Old Testament God, Yahweh. And so the Sabbath principle forces us to ask ourselves is, do we secure our own value and identity? Do we work for our own security? Are we justified by faith or by works? If you think about the religious leaders, they're trying to obey to be accepted. And so the result is that the purpose of the law and the purpose of the Sabbath was to get as many details organized as possible so they could feel secure about themselves and their identity. They've got a religious to-do list. If you do that, you won't gravitate towards the intent of the law. You'll write into the law all kinds of observances to assure yourself you're okay. And you'll end up very nervous in life. Have I obeyed enough? You'll become very judgmental in life. I've obeyed more than that person. I'm better than that person. And you'll become cliquey. Can I get round me people who think exactly and live exactly like I do? I don't want to go with those pagan people out there. You see, religious leaders don't have the emotional, these religious leaders don't have the emotional security. They don't realize how much God loves them before any obedience to handle a law that uses broad brushstrokes to paint a life of love and obedience. They want to narrow it down, detail it out, button it up to feel good about themselves. They don't realize that Jesus is there in their presence saying, I love you. I want to heal you like I want to heal this man's hand. Will you come to me? They don't realize that they're desperately striving for rest, Sabbath, when Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath in their presence. Augustine said, St. Augustine famously said, our hearts remain restless till they find rest in him. They were restless, these religious leaders, but they wouldn't come to the Lord of the Sabbath to get rest. And Jesus later, in Mark's Gospel, is going to be on a cross. And on the cross, he's going to shout out very famously, it is finished. There is no more work to be done. Now rest. I've done all the work. I've done all the work to cover your sin, to cover your shame, to heal your hearts. It is finished. You don't have to prove yourself. You don't have to strive. You don't have to compare any longer. I'm going to give you a joy that tastes better than wine. I'm going to give you a security that lasts beyond the grave. I'm going to give you an identity you could never achieve. You can rest in the arms of the great physician and have your soul healed. That's the power of the gospel. We're justified by faith, not by works. Which paradigm are you living out of? I have to be good to be acceptable. I'm accepted by Jesus in all my mess. How can I respond out of love? One makes you kind and caring, one makes you judgmental and hypocritical. Now, just to finish off and to think about where you do stand, there's a divided response. And the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. It's very interesting. The Herodians and the Pharisees never normally collaborated because they viewed the world so differently. So here you have two sets of enemies becoming friends to kill Jesus. It's a pattern that's going to dominate his life and church history. The Herodians were supporters of Herod, the nastiest corrupt puppet king who was put in place by the Romans to ensure Roman law was upheld. They were not religious, and they brought the Greek approach to body and sex and life wherever they went. Herodians. The Pharisees were the strictest of Jews, whose aim in life was to stop Israel becoming contaminated by the likes of the Herodians and other Greek pagans. They didn't want this liberal, cosmopolitan, immoral agenda coming into Israel. And yet they're now friends. What does it tell you? It tells you something vital. It tells you that the gospel, the good news of Jesus, that he's the great physician who's come to heal us in our mess, is opposed to religion and irreligion, moralism and immoralism, legalism and license, conservative conformity and liberal self-discovery. It's a bit like the story of Frozen and Elsa. It is, trust me, stay with me. She starts the story as a Pharisee, Elsa, doesn't she? She does. Just stay with me, okay? One of the questions is going to be, Steve, why do you have such bad analogies? And we'll ask that in the Q&A. She starts off as a Pharisee. In other words, she's a rule keeper. She's constantly telling her sister Anna, don't do that, don't do that. We've been told by mummy and daddy, don't do that. I can't take my gloves off. And just fear is dominating her life. She's a Pharisee. And she lives encaved in a castle in the valley. You know the story. She starts off as a Pharisee, a rule keeper, keeps all the rules. And then she has a famous moment and says, I'm going to break every rule. In fact, there are no right, no wrong, no rules for me. She's suddenly a Herodian. I'm self-discovery. She ends up just as lost. A castle in the mountains with no friends. In other words, whether you're a Pharisee or Herodian, you're lost. You're sick. whether you're into moral conformity, like the religious leaders, and you think, the good ones are in and the bad people are out, and of course we're the good ones, you're lost. Or if you're into self-discovery and you say, oh no, the progressive open-minded people are in and the judgmental bigots are out, and of course we're the open-minded ones. You see, you can very easily think, yes, I knew I was right. Religion and religious people are bad and we all need to be open-minded. It's too simplistic. It's Christopher Hitchens' argument. It doesn't have enough nuance. When Jesus ends religion and replaces it with himself, he's not calling us to less obedience, but more and for the right reasons, so we know and love God and our neighbour. In modern Dublin, there's an enormous amount of self-righteousness about self-righteousness. We progressive urbanites are so much better than people who think they're better than themselves. We disdain those religious moralistic types who look down on others. Do you see the irony? The way of self-discovery leads to as much superiority and self-righteousness as the religious people do. That's why they both want to kill Jesus. Neither of them can stand him. Neither can accept they're sick and they need a doctor. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. Find rest in him, is what he's saying. Let me end with a quote. It was it's a story I read in a book where an imaginary conversation between an early Christian and their neighbour in Rome. The Christian neighbour says, I hear you are religious. Great. Religion is a great thing. Where is your temple or holy place? We don't have a temple, replies the Christian. Jesus is our temple. No temple? But where do your priests work and do their rituals? We don't have priests to mediate the presence of God, replies the Christian. Jesus is our priest. No priest? But where do you offer your sacrifices to acquire the favour of your God? We don't need a sacrifice, replies the Christian. Jesus is our sacrifice. What kind of religion is this? Sputters the pagan neighbour. And the answer is no kind of religion at all. Jesus says, I've come to do away with religion. I've come to give people a personal relationship with the Lord of all, who's the Lord of the Sabbath, in which our hearts can find rest. He's the great doctor, the great physician, who's come to offer us forgiveness if we'll understand it.